So, on with the show. Before we get started, a little about Lee. So, Lee Herbert was born in the Middle East. He grew up in Africa and has lived in Europe and New Zealand, but now he calls Melbourne, Australia, home, a place that I really want to visit someday. Here, it's beautiful over there. He's Yeah, I hear. Yeah. So Lee spent 10 years working for Apple as a trainer. So he and I have a common ancestor there. And he also creates high-end corporate films through his own production company. And now, in his copious spare time, he runs popular workshops around the world, teaching people about photography and video production, much like you're going to learn here. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to step off the stage and hand the mic over to Mr. Lee Herbert. Lee, it's all yours.
Cool, thanks, Frederick. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this. It's going to be a lot of fun. And since we don't have a lot of time, I think I'm just going to jump right in there and get started. So just a quick look at our agenda. Today we're going to be starting off with just talking about a couple of basics when it comes down to video production and shooting and editing. Then we're going to talk about audio because that's a really, really important part of when you're shooting video and just understanding how to improve that for you. And then we're going to go over some guidelines, and if anyone's seen any of my workshops, I'm notorious for doing this. I start talking about everything that I'm going to do in the agenda, and I'm not going to do that this time. We're going to skip right past the agenda and kick right into things. So the first thing that I want to talk about is why do you want to do video? And I'm actually going to just hand this over to Frederick for a moment and ask you the question, when you started making the transition to video, what was that decision and why did you make that decision?
That's a great question. For me, is only because all my friends were doing it. No, not the peer pressure. Um, it's for many, many reasons. So I do a lot of multimedia, much like this webinar, for This Week in Photo, and I needed to add an additional skill to my tool belt. And initially, I thought, hey, you know what? I have the Adobe Creative Cloud, and in that I've got Premiere. So I'll just use Premiere, and Premiere looks a lot like Photoshop. That's the path of least resistance. I know Photoshop really well, so I'll translate those skills over to Premiere and After Effects, and we'll be good to go. But I think, as you'll talk about in this presentation, my experimentation led to Final Cut, and that worked a little bit better for the way my brain is wired. Not saying one's better than the other, but Final Cut Pro just worked better for the stuff that I wanted to do. But in terms of the things that I needed to get done, it's like editing one-on-one videos, live action videos that I record, webinars like this. I'm still a huge fan of motion graphics, so I want to learn how to do that better. I used to use After Effects every day, then stopped, and now there's other tools, so I'm kind of getting excited about relearning that. And then I think, Lee, the biggest thing was, it probably happened when I started making the transition to Micro Four Thirds. And a lot of my cameras, or at least two of my cameras now, have 4K video capabilities. So I'm like, okay, I need to use that, but how do I make the most of it? Hence this journey of learning how to do video. So that's my little short story.
Cool, brilliant. Well, thanks, Frederick. Yeah, and just to add a little bit to that, I've found a lot of people who've come to my workshops are professional photographers who've had clients say to them, "Oh, we love your work, but do you do video as well? And can you add video to your bow of talents?" And a lot of them have come from that, where you've got these amazing stills cameras that record amazing video, and a lot of people are finding that they push that little red button and they start recording video, and they get it back into wherever it is they want to get it, and it doesn't look that good, and they come to me going, help me make it look good. So that's also what I find a lot of people are coming from. And just one thing to talk about before we get into it, the reason why we're talking a lot about editing is because it's very possible to take an amazing photo and you don't have to do anything to it. You get that photo right in camera and you just go with the photo. When it comes to video, that's not really an option. You can't really just record video and not do any editing with it. Video will always need to be edited, so it's really important to, even if you're not going to be editing it yourself, to understand the editing process so that when you're giving your raw footage to your editor, you make their life a lot easier, and also you've captured the stuff that you need to capture to tell an engaging story. So let's jump right into some of the basics. And the first thing we're going to talk about, really basic, is frames per second. So this is really just explaining what it is that film or video is. And when you're shooting film or video, it effectively is just a photo, but it's a whole bunch of photos played really quickly one after the other, and that's your frames per second. Each frame is a photo that's played right after the other thing. The, the thing that a lot of people find confusing when they get started is there's all these different sorts of frame rates, and I've just put a whole list of them up on the slide deck, and there's even more to deal with. So let me just explain really quickly the basics between these frame rates. To begin with, it comes down to geography. So in the US and North America and Japan, they shoot in NTSC, or 30 frames per second. And then pretty much in the rest of the world, we all shoot at 25 frames per second. I'm not going to bore you as to the history as to why, but it's sort of similar around the thing of, why do we have different electrical plugs? It's just different systems developed in different areas. So you got 25 frames per second, 30 frames per second. In terms of which one you shoot at, nowadays the water's become a bit muddy on that, because it used to be that if you were delivering in the US, you had to shoot in 30 frames per second. If you were delivering outside of the US and Japan, you shoot at 25 frames per second, and when it goes to TV and it goes to air, it needs to be in that frame rate. But because most of the stuff that we're doing these days is just going online, then it doesn't make as much of a difference, because online you can pretty much play any frame rate you like. So effectively, unless your stuff's going to air on TV in different geographies, it doesn't make as much of a difference. Having said that, you always want to future-proof yourself, so you want to think about that when you're picking your frame rate. When you get into the higher frame rates, so for example, I've got there 48 frames per second, 50 frames per second, 60 frames per second, that is when you want to do slow motion. So the more frames you've got, when you slow it down, you've got that information. If you shot something at, let's say, 25 frames per second, and you want to slow it down by 50%, 100%, 200%, as you start stretching that out on your timeline in your video editor, it's gonna get mushy. It's gonna start getting staggered, and it's not going to be very smooth movement, because at the end of the day, your camera didn't capture those frames. It didn't capture that information. Now, most non-linear editors, the editing softwares that we use these days, are smart enough to try and guess what was happening in there. It's almost like Photoshop's smart tool where you brush out the background and it kind of works out what was in the background. So they're not bad, but really, if you do want to shoot stuff and use it, slow it down and use it in slow motion, you want to shoot at a higher frame rate. Actually, jumping back to the original stuff, I should just quickly mention 24 frames per second is what film was shot at. So this is one of the reasons why people are really excited when they get a stills camera and it does 24 frames per second. So the difference between 24, 25, and 30 is the look and the feel a lot. So your 25 and your 30 is more of a video look and feel, so it'll be very sharp. And you'll notice this when you're watching TV, particularly on the high-end HD TVs, which most of us have these days. If something's been shot in video, it'll be very sharp. It'll be very, very crisp and clear. If something's been shot at 24 or has some plugins applied to it to sort of muddy it up a bit, because film has got sort of like it's just not clear and sharp. It's got a nice kind of little bit of grain to it, and I always find it amusing that as a photographer, you're always looking for the clearest and sharpest lens, and you want to get it, tack sharp. Whereas with film, it's quite funny because filmmakers, we've actually spent thousands of dollars on plugins for our video editors to add grain to our images, to make it a bit grainy, to give it more of a film look.
And Lee, I had a quick question for you as you step through this before you move on to the next section regarding frame rates. So we, as photographers, have iPhones now. Many of us have the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus that does 240 frames per second. We've got our point and shoot cameras that may do a slower frame rate. We've got mid-range like GH4 cameras that'll do 60 frames per second and all this. How do we know which frame rate, and how do we choose that frame rate? How do we know which one to choose? And when we bring all that footage, say I shot some footage with my iPhone and then some with my little LX100 and then some GH4 footage, and I bring all that into Final Cut, how do I make sure that I'm not just making a mess with all these mixed frame rates and it's just going to look bad?
Excellent question. So you do generally want to talk about that and think about that before you get started. So you want to try and stick to something. So if you're going to be shooting something that's going to be used outside of North America and Japan, you generally shoot at 25 frames per second. If you're shooting in North America and Japan, you shoot at 30 frames per second. Once you start getting into the higher frame rates, as long as you've got the same multiple, that's absolutely fine. So if you were shooting at 25 frames per second and you want to get some slow-mo footage, you shoot at 50 frames per second. If you were shooting at 30 frames per second, you shoot at 60, and so on. In terms of mixing footage with different frame rates, so if you shot something at 25 and then you shot something, as you said, on your iPhone, which shoots only at 30 or multiples of 30, that's actually, it's going to be okay. There could potentially be some issues, and you want to avoid that if possible, but applications like Premiere and Final Cut and even iMovie are smart enough that you can mix multiple frame rates on the same timeline, and the application, pretty much 90% of the time will sort out any issues for you.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's one of the things you want to avoid it, but if you forget to change the frame rates on your camera, it's not the end of the world. And most of the cameras that we use these days, you do actually have to pick. So, for example, I shoot a fair bit of stuff nowadays on the Sony A7S, and if you want to shoot at 25 or PAL, or if you want to shoot at NTSC, 30 frames per second or 25 frames per second, you actually have to go into settings and change the camera from PAL mode to NTSC mode.
Yeah.
So it's a very conscious decision that you have to make. It's not something that you could flick and switch by accident.
Got it. Okay.
Cool. And actually, just something that I forgot to talk about in the previous slide is, why we're talking about Final Cut as opposed to Premiere. It purely comes down to a choice in terms of what you prefer. I'm not going to say that one is better than the other. I am blatantly biased because I am a Final Cut Pro trainer, but Premiere is an amazing application. It's got some great features. It is perfect for a lot of people. The reason why I think Final Cut, particularly for photographers, is a really good choice is a little bit of background, and I'll try not to go into too much detail on this, is when Final Cut Pro 10 first came out, there was a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth in the editing community because it was phenomenally different from Final Cut Pro 7. It didn't just change the look and the feel, it changed the workflow. It's almost as if Adobe brought out a new version of Photoshop and all your buttons moved and they called them everything else, and you didn't use the magic wand anymore, you used something else. So the main difference, and again, it's one of the things, once you get your head around how Final Cut Pro 10 works, it is amazingly powerful and amazingly fast. I know you did a webinar with Chris Fenwick a while ago, and he's got a great phrase where he says Premiere Pro is like Final Cut Pro 8, which I think is a great way of describing it, where Premiere kept the same dynamic and the same workflow that Final Cut Pro 7 had, but it has all the great modern features that a modern editing application needs to have, whereas Final Cut Pro 10, Apple went, you know what, we think we need to shake things up, as they often do, and change the way that people edit footage. And I'm just going to jump out of my slide deck really quickly and jump into Final Cut Pro 10 and just show you a couple of little quick examples of what makes it a really powerful tool. The first thing that makes it really powerful, and I know there might be a little bit of a delay, so I'll try and speak a bit slower while I'm demoing stuff, is keywords. So here, if you're looking at my screen, and Frederick, if you can't see it, just give me a shout out so I know to change things. I've got a small project that I was working on a while ago, and as I'm scrolling through my browser, you can see I've got tons and tons of clips, and this is one of the challenges with video when you're editing, is you've got so much footage to work with. And so here I've got a clip, and while I'm going through this, I need to organize my footage. So a really powerful tool is keywords. So as I'm going through my footage and I'm sort of trialing it, I go, okay, well, I want to use this clip from over here. So I set in an endpoint by clicking I, and then I slide a little bit further ahead and click O for out, and that's a clip that I might want to use. Now, back in the day, you had to create bins and sub-bins and move things around, whereas with Final Cut, you just give this a keyword, and you can give the same bit of footage different keywords. And then if you look towards the left of my screen, I'm just going to open up this project, and you can see where all of my keywords live. And this is a really powerful tool because one of the biggest challenges when you're editing footage is just finding stuff. And again, I could spend 2 hours just explaining keywords to you, but keywords is a really powerful tool in Final Cut Pro 10. And the other really big powerful tool in Final Cut Pro 10 is the magnetic timeline. And what the magnetic timeline is you can see on my timeline down here at the bottom, I've got some footage and I've got a clip connected to my main timeline. And back in the days, if I wanted to move these two clips around, I'd have to move them one at a time. Whereas with Final Cut, when I pick one clip up, if another clip is connected to it, it will go with it. And also when I put it in the timeline, it'll move everything around it because the timeline, it's magnetic stuff, adjusts according to the things around it. Whereas in Final Cut Pro 7 and in Premiere, when you move stuff, everything else stays in place, so you have to kind of undelete and redelete and sort of move things around. So just moving stuff around and just trialing the creative process is really powerful in Final Cut Pro 10 because you don't have to worry so much about the technical stuff and you can just get on with being creative. Does that kind of make sense? Explain a couple of things, Frederick?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and your pacing is good. You know, remember the delay is trying to keep up with you on the video, but I think you're going well.
It's making sense? Brilliant.
Yep.
So jumping back into the slides, that's sort of a very basic look at frame rates, and hopefully that makes sense. And the next thing I want to talk about is audio. Now, audio is phenomenally important. I cannot stress how important audio is when shooting video because you can have footage that looks kind of okay, but as long as there's good audio, people will be engaged and people will stick with it. You could have the most beautiful, amazing footage that's ever been shot, and if your audio is not good, people are not going to really engage with it and people are not going to watch it because, yeah, you just, like and you'll notice this as you start working with video stuff is, like, I've become the biggest audio snob. I'll go and find, some tutorial or something on YouTube, and if I can hear that the person's just using the built-in mic on their computer and you can hear that terrible echo in the room, I'm like, oh, I just can't watch it. So the first thing that I would suggest if you're getting serious into video is get a microphone. It doesn't really matter what microphone, but get a microphone. You can get pretty cheap stuff these days that you can get some really amazing results. Going past that, there's two sorts of microphones that you would look at getting. So there's a shotgun mic and a lavalier mic, or as people in the industry call it, a lav mic. And I'm just going to explain the difference between those two. So a shotgun mic is a microphone that normally will be mounted on your camera, and as the name would suggest, it shoots out sort of like a cone of audio capture in front of your camera, and that's going to capture everything that's going on. There are normally settings on some of the more sort of medium and high-end microphones that will allow you to narrow that stream. So you can say, right, well, if someone's standing 5 feet in front of me, don't capture all the audio from the side of me, just capture the audio in front of me, which is going to capture that person's audio. And this is the kind of audio that you're generally going to use in location shoots. So if you're, as the term goes, running and gunning, you got the camera in your hand, you're running around a location, and you need to sort of capture what's going on. If you are recording someone speaking, and you definitely want to capture what they're saying, I would suggest going with a lavalier mic or a lav mic. And a lav mic is one of those mics, if you've ever watched the news, you'll notice it's mounted sort of on the person's collar. And so that's a little mic that, how that works is that generally creates sort of like a bubble, normally about 2 to 4 feet around the microphone. So it's going to capture all the audio coming from within that area, and it's going to try and ignore any audio outside of that area. Whether you go wireless or wired, that's getting a bit fancy. A brand that I really like using is Rode. They're a nice bunch of local guys here in Australia. Really great mics, really great audio that comes out of it. But as I said, any mic you want is fine to go as long as you get a mic and you don't use the mic on your camera. Having said that, microphones are a little bit like cameras. The best one is the one you have with you. I was at there was the Australian International Air Show a couple of weeks ago, and I was just there with some mates trying out some new toys that I had. I got a cool new stabilizer, so I was mucking around, and this scene group comes out of nowhere while we're standing by the B-52 and says, "Oh, hey, look, our photographer didn't show up. Do you mind shooting some stuff of us?" And we ended up shooting this impromptu music video in the cockpit of a United States Air Force B-52, which was pretty awesome. But I didn't have my microphones on me, so I just used the mic on the camera. And you can go have a look at the video on my website and on my blog, and it actually turned out a lot better than I thought it was. So, as much of a snob as I am, if you have to use the built-in camera microphone, you have to use it, but try and carry mics around with you. A really cheap option is Rode make a thing called the SmartLav Plus, which I think is about $60 or $70. It's a really cool little lavalier mic that you can actually plug into your smartphone, and what's handy about that is that way your talent can be standing, 10, 20, however many feet away, and you don't have to be close to them to capture the audio on your microphone on your camera. They're getting the audio further away. Just a quick FYI on that, I learned with that particular microphone, remember to put your phone into airplane mode, because if someone tries to ring you while it's recording, it will stop recording. So,
Hey, Lee, a quick question on that, on lav mics versus, or external mics versus the built-in mics on your computer. What I've been doing is using the built-in mic as reference audio and then recording separately into a digital audio recorder like a Zoom H4n or a Zoom H6 to get the good audio, but then having the audio that the camera records so that Final Cut can have something to match up to later. Is that a good idea, or should I be recording just a separate source into the camera?
Oh no, that is absolutely a fantastic idea. You definitely want to be getting, and that actually talks to my next point is that you want to have more than one source of audio, because the biggest thing with audio is that if something goes wrong with your audio, it's either impossible or really hard or really expensive to fix later on. So I'll normally have a shotgun mic on my camera, and I'll have a lav pointed somewhere else, or I might have two shotguns or something. So you generally always want at least two sources of audio. A, because if something goes wrong, you've got another source. But B, as you mentioned, Frederick, having that second source, when you bring that into your editor, you can then match them up. And Final Cut Pro has this amazing multicam function, which makes it ridiculously easy to sync up multiple angles and audio of video to sync them up together. Worst comes to worst, if you can't sync them together, you can do it manually, and we'll talk a little bit about that sort of like 3 points ahead. But in a very long answer to your question, yes, definitely record audio on your camera as well, because it's going to make your life easier matching it up. And if something went wrong with your, I'm doing the inverted commas thing, your proper microphone, at least you've got the audio from your camera that you can use in a pinch. Having said that, if you can record to a separate audio recorder and not use the preamps in your camera, that is preferable. As I said before, the other day I used the preamps in my camera and I used the microphone in my camera for a shoot that just kind of came out of nowhere, and it turned out perfectly. So it's all of these things are just guidelines, and I'm not saying, oh, never do this, never do that, because this is in an ideal world. You wouldn't plug your main microphone where you want to get your ultimate audio that you're going to use into your camera. The reason why is because the preamp, which is sort of like the device in your camera that translates that audio, is not going to be as good as a professional recording audio device like the Zoom H4n. I use the Tascam DR40, which is tomato, same thing by a different manufacturer. So yeah, if you can record your audio to a separate device, that's going to get a better audio signal and a better audio file. Having said that, unless you're an audio engineer or a real audiophile, 99% of people aren't really going to notice. But again, it's like shooting in RAW. If you shoot in RAW, at least you've got a lot more options later to fix things than if you shot in JPEG. The next thing to talk about, and this refers back to actually something that you talked about in your question earlier, Frederick, with the syncing up your audio, is have a clapperboard. A clapperboard is, you guys would have all seen one of these in any movie about making a movie, where they stand in front of the camera and they go, scene 5, take 42, mark, and then they clap. The clapperboard, as quaint as that might look, there is actually a really good reason for that. Is if you're shooting multiple cameras and multiple angles, and for some reason your video editing software isn't able to synchronize those using the audio, you're going to need to either synchronize them manually using the audio, or you're going to need to synchronize them visually. So as long as you've got all of your cameras pointed at that clapperboard when the person using it claps it, you can then bring that into your editing software and just look at all those angles and match them up, so it makes your life a lot easier when you do need to match those up. And the final point that I want to talk about in audio is we'll fix it in post. No, you bloody well won't. And this goes back to what I was saying, where audio is really, really hard to fix in post. So, I mean, I have spent literally thousands of dollars on software and plugins that allow me to make my audio better. And just the logic with that, like, again, I had to justify the cost to my wife. That's the most important thing. Is when I went and said, oh, well, I want to spend $1,200 on a plugin that's going to help fix some audio. If I go out on a corporate shoot and I mess up my audio, or something goes wrong with there's noises and clicks and pops and what have you, if I have to go back and reshoot that, that's going to cost me a lot more than $1,200. So it really pays to try and get your audio right when you shoot it, and you have less to worry about afterwards. So now getting into some guidelines, and I call these guidelines instead of rules because it's really important to understand that rules in video are really meant to be broken. So absolutely, it's a very artistic thing. It's a craft. So if you want to break any of these rules, absolutely go for it. You want to have a particular look and feel for something, absolutely go for it. But you've got to know the rules before you can break them. So with that in mind, let's talk about shutter speed. The reason, in terms of shutter speed, the general rule of thumb is you want to set your shutter speed on your camera to double of whatever your frame rate is. So if you're shooting at 25 frames per second, you want to set your shutter speed to a 50th. If you want to shoot at 50 frames per second, you should set your shutter speed, wow, that's a tongue twister for me this morning, you want to set it to double that. So if you're shooting at 50, you shoot at 100 shutter speed, so on and so forth. The reason why this is a very important rule of thumb is this will affect the way that movement looks inside of your video. So if you shoot at a really low shutter speed, just like you would if you were doing a long exposure, the movement in your video is going to be very smudgy. It's going to be, people are just going to be sort of blurs as opposed to clear. And you'll actually notice with most cameras, most DSLRs and Micro Four Thirds and mirrorless cameras, when you set it into video mode, it actually won't let you set a particularly long shutter speed. Like generally it won't let you go below, I think, 25 or 20 because it's kind of going, look, if you want to shoot video at a second's exposure, it's just not going to work, because if you think about it, if it's got to shoot a frame every 25 seconds, that's as slow or as fast as your shutter speed can be. And I've got a little video just after this to demonstrate what I mean by how it'll affect your movement, and also the other way around. If you set your shutter speed too fast, your video is going to look very staccato, is the phrase that we use, and that means it's going to look almost too crisp and too clear, and it won't look natural. So here's a little video that I prepared to show you a very basic example of this. So here's me spinning a cable at a shutter speed of 10, and you can see there that it's all very blurred, and you can barely see the cable that I'm spinning around. Then at 25 frames per second, it's starting to look a little better, but it's still not looking absolutely natural. At 50 frames per second, this is ideal because I was shooting this at 25 frames per second. There's still blur, but that's what your eye would normally see. At 500, you see what I mean by it's starting to look quite staccato and it's almost too crisp. And at 1600, it's kind of almost ridiculous. Does that make sense, sort of, Frederick, in terms of that video kind of solidify what I meant in terms of why you want to set your shutter speed double to your frame rate?
Yeah, it did. Just FYI, the video on the other end here is coming through as more of a slideshow, but I think we got the idea with the motion blur from the different frames that it was showing.
Cool. Well, if you want, what I can do is I can just chuck that video up onto my YouTube channel, and we'll make a link available later, and then people can go have a look at it.
Excellent. Let's do that.
So the next one that I want to talk about is shooting for the edit. And what I mean by shooting for the edit is a lot of photographers that I train come to me with a photographer's eye, and photography and video, even though you're still using cameras and you're using the same cameras a lot of the time, the way you set up your composition is generally going to be the same, but what you do to tell the story is going to be very different. So the example that I always give is someone walking through a door. So if you were a photographer and you were shooting someone walking through a door, you might just pick up the camera, set up your frame, get that point in time because you're only capturing that one moment, and take a photo maybe as the person is reaching for the door handle or as the door is opening from the other end. You sort of get that, point of view look. With video, it's very different. A lot of people that I talk to when they first come into video from photography, if I say to them, right, we'll film this person walking through the door, they'll pick up the camera, start recording, and just follow the person walking through the door and not change their composition at all. With video, it's very different because you've got a lot more tools to work with. So with video, you might get a wide shot to start the person walking through the door. Then you might get a medium shot in profile of them walking towards the door in profile. Then you might go to a close-up of the door handle as their hand grabs the handle. Then you'll have another maybe medium or wide on the other side of the door as it opens facing them. You kind of get where I'm going to. You use all these different shots to tell the story. An example that I could think of in photography is I did a street photography workshop with Valerie Jardin last year, and one of the things she talked about that she does in her street photography is she tells a story, and the way she does it is she'll take multiple shots. So she'll start with, let's say, someone, a busker in the street. She'll start with a wide of the busker, then she'll go to a medium of, the busker's hands on the guitar and the whole guitar, and then she might do a real, sort of macro close-up of just one hand playing the guitar. And that's how you tell the story through video. I'm just going to jump out of my slides again and into Final Cut. I'm not sure how well this will play back for the folks because of the delay, but I shot some stuff, and God bless my wife who puts up with a lot with me. So I shot just some examples, and just tell me if this sort of comes through. So the first one that I'm going to play is if you were just playing this back just with one angle. So here's my wife just walking through a door, and I'm following her as she walks through the door. Fairly straightforward. Did that play all right for you, Frederick?
Yeah, it's playing, but we're at about maybe 5 frames every 10 seconds or something like that. So okay, we got the idea of your wife walking through the door.
Cool. So the next one, I then shot the same thing, but if I was shooting it from a video editor's point of view, and hopefully at least some of the shots will sort of make sense here. So I'll just play this back. So here's a bit of a wide in profile, then you get a close-up of the handle, then you go back to the wide, then you go to the other side of the door, and then you go to multiple different angles. Hopefully that came through a little bit.
Yep.
Cool. So that's sort of what I mean in terms of when you're shooting for the edit, think about the coverage that you need to get, and it may even pay if you're not going to edit it yourself. Have a chat to your editor or someone that you know who edits and say, hey, look, how would you shoot this? And with video, I'd much rather have the footage and not need it than need the footage and not have it. So shoot away, go crazy, and just like I did with my wife last night where I was like, oh, we're going to do the door video again. Have a bit of a play, find someone or find something that you want to shoot and just experiment. And we're all learning all the time. And I know that, where I was a year ago and as a shooter where I am now, I'm so much better. The more you do, the better you'll get.
Hey, Lee, before you continue, I want to see if we can't stick a quick poll in here to take the temperature of the audience. The folks that are watching / listening to this, we put together a couple of polls just to kind of get an idea of where your head / brain is at with regard to your biggest challenges in photography or video. So on your screen now, you should be, hopefully you should be seeing a poll for that. So your biggest challenge in photography or video, A, overwhelm. The next one is choosing the right gear, previous failures, discouraging future attempts, or the last one is education. So go ahead and choose in there. I see a ton of responses coming through, and it looks like I'm not going to give it away to taint the audience, but at the end of this, I'll let you know, and I'll shut it down in just a minute. Very interesting. Cool. So 50% of you have voted. Very good. Very good. Okay, Lee, you can continue.
So the next, well, no, I don't want. No, I'm kidding. So So the next thing I want to talk about is a rule which seems really stupid for pretty much I think 100% of people in the room, including me, is never cut or edit something that you've shot, which is just completely impractical because I think most of us are gonna shoot stuff that we should edit. And I think that if you're working in an environment where you're working with people who are just camera ops or they're just editors, I think they should swap jobs at least once a year so they can appreciate where the other person's coming from. But why I put this guideline in here is that as a as someone who's capturing images, whether it's a photographer or a videographer or cinematographer, what have you, your job is to capture something really beautifully and get that perfect shot and just tell a story with this beautiful shot. As an editor, your job A is to tell a story, but B, almost as importantly, is to slash and burn. Your job is to cut, and get stuff out of the story. Make the story as streamlined as possible. So, when I was just shooting stuff and I wasn't editing and I was taking this to editors, so often the worst thing is sitting there with the editor because the editor will sit there and go, okay, well, this shot over here of the girl running through the rain in the moonlight, it doesn't help tell the story. We're cutting it out. And you're sitting there going, oh my God, we spent 3 hours in the freezing rain shooting that shot. It's beautiful. It's amazing. What do you mean we're not using it? And the editor's like, it doesn't help the story. I don't care. It's getting cut. So the reason why I put this in there is I want people to think about that when they're editing the footage. When you're shooting the footage, get the footage. But when you're editing it, you can't be emotionally attached to the footage. You can't be sitting there going, oh, I really want to use the shot. I've got to find a way to use this shot. That's not what you want to be thinking when you're editing. What you want to be thinking about when you're editing are the people who are going to be watching this video. Whenever I sit down with a corporate client and we start pre-production, the main two questions that I ask them about the film that we're going to create is, number one, what's the message that you want people to walk away with when they watch this video? And you want to keep that nice and concise. And number two, what do you want them feeling? And as an editor, those are the only two things you really care about. So it doesn't matter if you've got footage that would win a Pulitzer Prize because it looks amazing. If it doesn't tell the story, you have to let it go, The next bit that I want to talk about is B-roll, B-roll, B-roll. So B-roll is the cutaways, the footage that you have on top of an interview, for example. So let's say I was interviewing the CEO of a company and they say, well, I love sitting in my chair, spinning around and going, wee! Well, now I need to go and get some footage of them sitting in a chair, smiling, looking happy, and going, wee! Because as they're talking about it, I can then use that footage to play on top of it. So if you're playing, let's say, an interview that's 2 or 3 minutes, if that interview is just a shot of that person's head while they're talking, obviously it's moving, that's still not very engaging. You want to have cutaways. You want to have video and images that are going to represent whatever that person is talking about. So B-roll is really, really important for that. The other reason why B-roll is really important is particularly when you're cutting interviews, you might want to make what I like to call a Frankensentence. A Frankensentence is basically when someone's said, something really, really good at the beginning of a sentence, and about 5 minutes later in the interview they said something that really applies well to that could be the end of the sentence, and you're actually going to cut the rest of those two sentences out and just glue those two sentences together. The problem with that is visually it's going to be very obvious that you did that because in the first sentence the head may have been leaning to the left, and in the second sentence the head may have been leaning to the right. But if you've got some B-roll to put on top of that cut point, you can actually get away with it, and as long as it sounds right, no one's going to know that you glued those two sentences together, which is, I think, why all politicians should have someone else recording their interviews so they've got footage of it so people can't make something else of their out of their footage. In fact, my wife hates me because I've ruined television for her because so often we'll be watching stuff and we can both look at each other and go, yep, no, that was a Franklin sentence. That's not how that person actually said what they just said. So that's B-roll, really, really important. I'm sorry that we're going through stuff really quickly, but we've only got 45 minutes to cover about 2 or 3 weeks worth of me talking. So come back for more.
And we'll do more of these later to add on to this. This is just the beginning, and then I think the next webinar you do, you're going to really dive deeply into the photographic tie-ins and that sort of thing. Hey Lee, before you continue, I want to share the results of that biggest challenge in photography poll that we did. So I'm going to share the results on your screen. So it looks like most of the folks that are in this webinar, at least, their biggest challenge in photography or video is education. So looks like they're in the right place. So,
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, welcome aboard.
welcome aboard. Yeah, there will be more. All right, cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next thing I want to look at is the 180-degree rule, and this is very important when you're shooting interviews or two people talking to each other. And again, I'm going to cut out of my slides and bring up my iPad to show you an example of this. What the 180-degree rule is, and let's bring up the old iPad. Oh, no, it's stopped mirroring. Hang on, sorry guys, just a couple of technical things here. I'm just going to switch this on. There we go. You're now seeing my iPad. So this is actually an app that I use, and I'll just hide Final Cut so it's not distracting you guys. This is an app that I use to create storyboards for my clients and when I'm sort of planning out my shots. But what the 180-degree rule means is if you've got two people standing across from each other, you need to always keep in mind with your camera positioning as if they had a line down the 180-degree angle between them, and your cameras can never cross that line. And what I mean by that is, so you can see I've got these two cameras, they're both on the right and the left of my two characters, and when I switch, if you have a look in the top right hand corner, when I switch from camera 1 to camera 2, it's very obvious in the shot that these two people are talking to each other. Now have a look what happens if I take camera 1, move it over to the right shoulder of my gentleman, and I'll just rotate that so you can see as if they're talking to each other. And when I change those shots from camera 1 to camera 2, camera 1 to camera 2, it actually doesn't look like they're talking to each other because the camera angle is the same for both of them. Now, again, if you want to break this rule, you can, but I will challenge every single person who's listening and watching this to watch TV for the next week or so and tell me if they see even once someone breaking the 180-degree rule, and I will put money down that you won't find more than one, maybe two examples of someone breaking the 180-degree rule. So that's a really, really important one to remember when you're shooting people talking to each other. It's one of those things where you'll see it and you'll go, it just doesn't make sense, and it's because you've broken the 180-degree rule. And the final thing to talk about in the guidelines, again, we'll fix it in post. No, you bloody well won't. And the reason why I go on about this is I'm a big believer of get it right in camera, because to put it in perspective, if I'm shooting, let's say, just a really easy, corporate testimonial, generally that'll take about maybe half a day to shoot, a day if we need to get a lot of B-roll, but that will generally take about anywhere from 2 to 3 to 5 to 6 days of editing, because I normally get the first draft done within a day, and then the client will always come back and they'll want changes. So if you don't get stuff right in camera, it's going to be a lot of work and a lot of effort to fix your exposure, fix your white balance, fix audio problems. So editing, you want your editing to be more about cutting the story and telling the story as opposed to fixing technical issues with your footage. Now, having said that, there will always be technical issues with your footage, because unless you're shooting everything in a studio and you always have complete control over your environment, you're going to be under pressure, you're going to be under time, you're going to forget to change a setting on your camera. Don't worry, even with us professionals, it happens to us all. There are ways to fix stuff, but the most you can get right in camera, so you have less to do when you're editing and you can just focus on the storytelling part of the editing, the better. And my final slide is just looking at some handy hints, and Frederick, I'm sure we'll have a place where we can put this up where it'll be available to everyone that they can have a look at the actual hints.
Yes.
On the left-hand side, I've got fcp.co. That's a really fantastic resource for, it's basically like a forum, and it's almost like TWIP for Final Cut Pro editors. So fantastic resource, really helpful people. If you've got any questions, if you want to show off your work, there really bunch of people out there. Ripple Training, they, other than, of course, coming to me for training face-to-face, they, for online training, are just absolutely amazing in terms of providing video tutorials, really in-depth and really easy to understand the way that they deliver the training. CapturingPassion.com, that's my website, and I try and get a tutorial out about once every 2 to 3 weeks on Final Cut Pro or Motion. And then FX Factory is a really great resource for third-party plugins. So if you want to add more functionality to Final Cut Pro, the amount of plugins that you can get that add some really cool, amazing features that you can, yeah, you can have a lot of fun with that. That's a really good resource, and there are literally thousands of different places. Well, maybe tens to twenties of places, but thousands of different plugins you can get for Final Cut, which will add the most amazing functionality to it. On the right-hand side, Rode are the guys that I get all of my mics from, so they're really great. But as I said, the brand doesn't matter as much. Just make sure you get some good mics. The Tascam DR40 is the audio recorder that I use. Really easy to set up, really easy to use, get some great results. As Frederick said, the Zoom H4, that seems to be the go-to for most people. But yeah, they're very similar. Sorry guys, something that I forgot to talk about in the shutter speed section, which I'm glad I had these in my slides to remind me, is because you're setting your shutter speed to a fixed rate and you can't really change it that much when you're shooting video, is something that you're going to absolutely have to have. The only bit of gear that I'm going to say you have to have when shooting video is a variable ND filter, or a variable, I've forgotten what the N stands for. Neutral density. A variable neutral density filter. The reason for that is because if you're shooting at a shutter speed of 25 and you want to get a beautiful shallow depth of field shot at f1.4 or f2.8, if you're shooting outdoors, all you're going to see is white because your camera is just letting too much light in. So in order to shoot video outdoors, pretty much you're going to have a neutral density filter on your camera. And actually, when you get up to the more mid to high range video cameras, they'll have neutral density filters built in. That's how important it is for video. And the final one that I've got there is Shot Pro. And Shot Pro is the app that you guys would have seen that I was using on my iPad to create my storyboards, which it's a really cool app. It's by iOS app standards pretty expensive. I think it's about $30, $35 Australian. But if you're going to be doing some video and planning your shots, which I cannot recommend enough, it's really important to not just turn up to a shoot and go, right, where should we point the camera? Have a good think about how you want to compose your shots and plan your shots before you turn up. Shot Pro is a fantastic resource for setting up your shots. And that's me. Should we jump into questions, Frederick?
Yeah, I think we should. Before we do that, though, I want to launch a poll here, our last poll, and this is about which camera do you use. So actually, I'm editing the poll now because I had a thought about the question in here that I wanted to put in here. So I'm just going to quickly edit this live while I'm talking and save it.
Well, just while you're talking about that, I'll just, speaking of gear, something that I really love so I switched from DSLRs to mirrorless cameras about a year ago, and one of the features, particularly coming across from those, and I'm sure these features will be coming up in a lot of DSLRs as well, is focus peaking.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, focus peaking is a feature that it looks at the high contrast areas in your image and it'll outline it in the color, so it'll outline it in red or green or whatever color. And that way you're in focus. The reason why that's so important for video is most video shot on DSLRs or mirrorless cameras, you're going to be using manual focus. The autofocus on most of these cameras hasn't quite caught up to where it needs to be to use it like you would use autofocus on a handy cam or something like that. So having tools that you can really nail your focus it's one of those things that really stands out on a day-to-day use. I use that 80% of my days when I'm shooting because I'm getting old and my eyes aren't what they used to be.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, this poll looks like we've got everybody who's going to vote. They've voted, so I'm going to show the results of this here. And this was, which camera do you use? So here are the results of that poll. Looks like it's mostly Nikon and Canon with and Sony's coming in there, and I think Sony's brand new, I think in terms of being a viable option for capturing video. Plus, and Lee, you can speak to this, is in terms of 4K video, I think they just added it when they launched the A7S. Was it the A7S that they added it?
Yes, the A7S.
Well, the A7 series, the A7 series, but with an add-on, you have to, it doesn't record directly to the card, whereas the Canon, Canon doesn't shoot 4K yet. If 4K is the benchmark, right? And then
Well,
Panasonic.
when you get up to the Canon 1DC, you'd have to go up to the Canon 1DC to shoot 4K, and that is a beautiful camera, but it's a beast.
Yeah, it's a beast in terms of how much you're going to be paying for that too, right?
Oh yeah.
So let's. So there's a bunch of questions that came in. I know we're close to the top of the hour, so I'll be quick with my comments. So first of all, thank you for doing this. It's very educational. I'm happy I recorded it because I'm going to listen to it again, probably while I'm editing it in Final Cut. But is that even legal? But thanks for doing this. I think that you did a really good job pulling this together. Much appreciated. So I jotted down some questions as you were talking, and I'm saving mine to the end, just like everyone else did. So my question first is, when we just launched that poll on which camera do you use, Canon, Panasonic, Sony, Nikon, other, Olympus, etc. If you are a photographer that is moving into video and you're at the point where, I mean, you may have a DSLR or something that you're like, okay, it's time for me to jump into something new, whether it's a new Canon, new Nikon, or maybe move over to the mirrorless side if you're so inclined. From your standpoint, Lee, where should photographers start that are, and just to paint a tighter picture, let's say they're a landscape shooter, and now they want to start adding motion to their repertoire and shooting some video to go along with those beautiful landscape vistas that they shoot. Where should they start?
First of all, pretty much every one of my answers is always going to start off with it depends. I should have been a lawyer. Always covering my tush. It really does depend. I suppose if you're doing it professionally, you need to sort of think about it more intensely. But if you're just starting out and you just want to get your head around stuff before you start charging for this, it doesn't matter. If you can shoot something that records video, shoot video and just start learning and getting your head around it. Once you start getting into the more professional side and starting to charge for this, if your stills camera, like for example with your example, if you're doing landscape, if you've got a really good landscape stills camera, like I'd imagine, like the Nikon D800 would be an amazing, because of that 36 megapixels, would be amazing for landscape. If that's the camera that shoots landscape photography really well, odds are it'll probably be pretty good at video too. So, particularly with landscape, I'm just thinking because it's not a lot of stuff's moving. So if you're shooting, sport or things like that, you might look at something a bit faster. But just as you would in photography, if it takes good photos of something, it's probably going to do decent video of the same stuff. So I'd say don't panic about going out and think, oh my goodness, I have to go out and buy a new camera. If you're using a camera that's got video functions for your still stuff, odds are it'll probably be, for just starting out, absolutely perfect for doing the same stuff in video.
Love it. Cool. I've got more questions. I'm going to hold them because there's more questions coming in. There's a ton of questions actually coming in that we want to get through. So thank you guys for submitting your questions that are watching and listening to this. If you have questions, go ahead and put them in there. I'm going to start blowing through them now from the top. First question is do you think it's worth using and learning Motion 5 to work with stills, especially using the camera function?
Well, I'm a Motion 5 master trainer, so absolutely come to my courses. They're amazing.
So yes. That was the shortest answer of all time. Yeah, go see my courses.
Yeah, come to one of my courses. As usual, it depends. It comes down to what you're doing. For those who aren't familiar with Motion is, in terms of the graphics and effects side of things, very similar to After Effects. Now, After Effects has a lot more features, and After Effects does a lot more than Motion does, particularly in compositing. But Motion, again, for most people who are coming fresh, is going to be fantastic. Sorry, I'm just going to go off topic for a second.
Go for it.
Something I forgot to talk about in the beginning was another reason why Final Cut's really good for photographers is if you're an editor and you've been an editor for ages in video, coming across from what you're used to Final Cut Pro 10 can be a little bit more challenging because you almost have to unlearn the way that you used to edit, whereas you're coming to Final Cut Pro fresh without prerequisites of, well, this is how I used to edit in Final Cut Pro 7. it's really easy to get into and really easy to get your head around and just jump in and get started. Just push buttons and see what happens. Motion, not so much. Motion, again, you can push buttons, but there's a lot of buttons.
Hmm.
And
Every time I launch
like what I
every
use
time I
Motion
launch
for,
Motionly, I get intimidated and I back away slowly.
and it can be. And look, I mean, like you could sit down with me for like I could sit down with you with Final Cut, and within 5 to 10 minutes have you up and running. With Motion, we'd probably need about half an hour to an hour,
Hmm.
maybe. Um, so just in terms of complexity, it is fairly complex. But actually, if people want to have a look, I've got a very short tutorial on my website about how to use Motion to create templates that you can use within Final Cut. So like to create lower thirds and things like
Cool.
that. To use ones that already exist in Final Cut and in Motion, and then just jig them up so you can edit them in Final
And
Cut.
what's your URL real
So
quick
yeah,
for people that are like, okay, I want to see that. What's the URL to your
yeah.
website?
So the website is capturingpassion.com,
Okay, perfect. All right.
and yeah, and those links
Okay, sorry about that. Next question up is if you, and sorry, folks that are listening, there's like a 1.5 second delay between here and Australia. So if we step on each other, apologies for that. Next question is if you shoot a video that could be shown in, say, Europe and the US, which frame rate should be used?
That is a very good question. If it's, I don't, yeah, you've stumped me. It's, I suppose go with the frame rate of where you live. So if you're in the US, shoot at 30. If you're in Europe, shoot 25. And again, nowadays it's far less of an issue than it used to be in the days of tape. So yeah, I'd say just go with locally what you're used to, or alternatively go with where you think it's going to be played, with the widest audience. Like if you, yeah, I
Would it
don't
be
know.
worth it? Would it be worth it? And depending on the end use, right? So if it's commercial and
Yeah,
you've got
yeah.
commercial usages in the U.S. and in Europe. For example, should they just be separate projects completely, where you edit a U.S. version and a Europe version and deploy them separately for the separate audiences?
Well, if it's going to broadcast, yes. And when I say broadcast, I mean it's going to terrestrial TV.
Hmm.
If it's going to digital, it really doesn't matter nearly as much as it used to.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, next question up. So this one is, so I've spent more than a decade working in video using mostly Final Cut Pro 7, which, well, Apple pulled an aperture on before they pulled an aperture. Anyhow, I'm having serious trouble wrapping my head around Final Cut Pro 10. It's like learning a new program, whereas Premiere seems to be a bit more in line with my workflow or with the workflow I was used to. Is it worth taking the time to basically learn a whole new program and workflow with Final Cut 10? Or is Premiere the better route for an old school cat like me? I'm using Final Cut 7 now, but having trouble keeping up with the new cameras, especially with 4K footage. I really want to stick to Final Cut Pro, but I don't want to feel like a beginner again. Lee, what do you think?
That comes down to how much you whether you do want to learn a new system or not, because I think the point you're making is absolutely correct. Final Cut Pro 10 is a new system, and you are going to need to learn it. I do think the learning curve is quite shallow, so getting your head around the differences of the workflow in Final Cut Pro 10, it won't take you as long as I think it thinks as you might think it's going to. If you want, chuck me an email. I'm more than happy to spend a couple of minutes with you. Like I said, I can show you the basics in 5 to 10 minutes, and you can be up and running. But if you don't want to learn that whole new workflow, it might be worth going into Premiere. Having said that, I know when Final Cut Pro 10 first came out, I just moved to Apple here in Australia. That was a fun week. And, even I had that moment of, what in heaven's name have they done here? Where are all my buttons? Where's everything gone? How in heaven's name do I do anything?
Yeah.
Having said that, I've been using it now for 4 years now, and, I go into Premiere every now and again when I need to. And again, it's just what you used to. Like, I find Premiere frustrating because I'm now so used to Final Cut Pro 10's workflow. So yeah, it's unfortunate. I can recommend, once you get your head around Final Cut Pro. As I said, I'm biased. I think I'm a lot faster in Final Cut, but then again, I know it inside and out, and I don't know Premiere inside and out. So
It's a
Yeah,
tool.
sorry, I couldn't really answer. It's something you have to answer yourself, I guess.
Yeah, it's a tool. And the cool thing is you can play with them before making that investment. And
Yeah.
yeah, and it's interesting that they're both Premiere. Like I don't want this to come off as a holy war against Premiere or anything like that because I think Premiere is awesome. I feel like
Yeah.
I'm decent in Premiere and After Effects and now Final Cut as well. But it's the right tool for the right job and what clicks with the way your personal synapses fire in your head, but the cool thing is it's software so you can play with it and see how it works. And but I would caution you, if you're considering Final Cut, like Lee was saying, it's a shallow learning curve, but it is a different mindset and paradigm that Final Cut Pro is using versus what Premiere is using with your traditional timeline versus this magnetic timeline metaphor. But if you approach, and this is me speaking from being in the mix of learning this thing, I feel like if you approach Final Cut expecting it to be Premiere only different, you're going to be disappointed. Like Lee said, if you approach it with a fresh slate, like, okay, how does this thing work? Then you'll
Yeah.
understand and get better at it, operating it on its own terms rather than trying to force fit it into someone else's paradigm. So okay, next question. And I'm not mentioning you guys' name that answered the questions because I don't have them in the list here because the way that I set up the registration, you're all anonymous mostly. So I just see friend in the in the question box. So this next TWIP friend says, can you mention that Final Cut Pro 10 makes it very easy to marry camera audio and H4n audio? So
Yeah.
yeah, talk about the synchronization thing, Lee.
Yeah. Cool. Well, okay. So let me actually just jump out of here, and I'll jump into Final Cut and just show you an example. So if I've got so here I've got some audio, and sorry, here's got some footage. So I'm just going to select that clip, and then I'm going to hold down Command to select some
Hang
audio,
on, go a
and now
little
I can just
slower.
right
Go a
click
little
on.
slower because we're
Oh,
lagging
okay.
behind you a little
Sorry.
bit.
Okay. So can you see that I've selected two clips in my browser towards the left-hand side of my screen?
Yes, we see that.
So I've selected the Shogun one, I've selected the Tascam one, and if I just right-click on those, oh, I've got to reselect them. And if I just right-click on those, I've got the third option down from the top is synchronize clips, and that's all there is to it.
That's it.
Yeah, and 95% of the time that just works. So that's synchronizing video and audio that's been recorded at the same time. If you want to synchronize video clips, so if you've shot a multicam clip, you just select a whole bunch of clips, and I'll just wait a little while for that, to the delay to come off. So I've selected 4 clips
Yep.
there, and I've right-clicked on them, and then hang on, let me just get rid of that little thing there, and I can right-click, and the second option from the top is say new multicam clip, and when I select that, it'll give me actually a whole bunch of options on how I wanted to synchronize it, but towards the bottom of the options, well, in the middle, you can see that it's got use audio for synchronization,
Mm-hmm.
and it'll just use the audio from all those clips to synchronize them.
Which is
Now,
killer.
that probably, yeah, to be fair, that probably works about 80% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as there's decent audio on all the video, that's fine. But if something's gone wrong, if the audio is really soft or something, it will sometimes kick it out a bit, and then you can fix that manually. And I know we're pressured for time, so I don't want to sort of show you that,
Oh
but
yeah.
we'll show you that next
Yeah,
time.
we'll do a part 2 on
Yeah.
that. That's good. Yeah, but the point is that going back to what I said earlier about that reference audio, right? So capturing that reference
Mm.
audio, and like Lee said, provided that it's good and it's strong audio, it could be crappy audio that your camera is capturing, but you're capturing that specifically to give Final Cut something to bite into when it's taking your good audio from your Zoom or whatever source and matching it up. So good
Yeah.
times. Another question here is a Zoom will also give you a stereo track that you can use for ambiance. Huh. Have you ever done that? So like natural sound?
I haven't. I've used, like I said, I use the Tascam, which is sort of same thing but different brand. I have used it to have. It's got 2 inputs, so I will have 2 microphones. But normally when I use that, it's when I've got 2 people talking to each other that I'll mic them both up, but I'll have them, 2 separate tracks going
Yep.
in. But that's a really cool feature. I'll have to have a play with that.
Yeah. Yep. Next one is more of a comment. This Twipper says, "Thanks for the presentation. I thought the focus was on making stills move in Final Cut Pro 10, but this is more of basics of video production. Perhaps I misunderstood the intent of the course." So yeah, so this did lean more towards the beginnings of video production in there, and Lee and I made the decision to lean it more towards that because we're going to be doing a series of these webinars under the same title that will build on each other. And we thought it best to, and since these are all free, we thought it best to give this way first to build the foundation, and then the next time he can dive into more individual areas and springboard off of this foundation into, you know, animating stills, and then also into, you know, things like multicam and slideshows and Ken Burns and all that stuff. So that stuff's coming, and you'll be notified when those hit. But just FYI, in case you think this webinar was misrepresented. Next question up is okay. Someone's asking what that storyboard app is, which you already showed us, and we'll have a link to all the links that Lee shared will be in the blog post for this webinar. Here's another question. This one's good. Is iMovie adequate for beginners and transferable to Final Cut Pro?
Yes and no. So the first question, iMovie is fantastic because iMovie is really powerful just for cutting stuff together and putting things and moving things around. I still use it sometimes, like the stuff that I shot at the air show. Mm-hmm. The first draft that I did, I edited that, which was amazing when you think about it. That I edited that footage on my iPad in iMovie on the way home. I wasn't driving, just so you know, because that would have been dangerous. So yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, it's not as transferable as it used to be. I mean, it's still XML, so you can do. Let me just check this, because you used to be able to export from iMovie to Final Cut just by exporting XML, but
like while you're looking that up, here's a mission to make. Here's a workflow that I'm curious about. So we've got iMovie on our iPhones and iPads, right? So could a person potentially go out and shoot some footage, some good, awesome footage, slow motion, all this, to get a bunch of clips on their iPhone, and then edit them and start a project on the iPhone or iPad, and then transfer that project over either into iMovie or Final Cut Pro 10 to actually do the proper edit on? So in other words, can you start a project on iOS and then complete it on the Mac?
Not anymore. Oh. So you used to be able to, and this is actually what caught me out when I did this thing about a week ago, is that you used to be able to send that project to your computer and then open up in iMovie, but I discovered that for some reason it looks like they've actually taken that out. Mm-hmm. So the iMovie on iOS is not as compatible as transferable to the iMovie on the computer. I need to dig in deeper because, yeah, like I said, if you'd asked me 2 weeks ago, I would have said yes, absolutely, but I actually tried to do this a week ago and it didn't work the way it used to.
Yeah.
So
but we can put this on the website. We'll put it on the website.
Yeah, I'll need to do some research and find out, because there is a section in iMovie's help that says send a project to Final Cut Pro 10, but it doesn't look like it's as simple as it used to be.
Okay.
It looks like you have to sort of convert it. So it won't. It used to be you could export the XML and you'd get your edits and your cuts and you just sort of pick up where you left off. But it looks like it's not as simple as it used to be.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll follow up. You can either put that in the blog post for this or in the comments on the post. Next question up, and I'm going to go relatively quick on this because we're about 15 after. I want to make sure we end before 30 after. Do you have any book or ebook recommendations to get started shooting video and using Final Cut Pro 10?
I don't, unfortunately. I should write one.
There you go. But you have training courses available, right? That people can.
Yes. Yeah. So I mean, as I said, we deliver Final Cut Pro training, here in Australia, and have trainer will travel. So face-to-face stuff is great. But for online stuff, not books, but for online stuff to get video tutorials online, the Ripple training guys are absolutely amazing.
Ripple training, yeah, yep. I'm a big fan of those.
Yeah, and that's one of the links that I shared.
Yep. And they're kind of related because they also do Mac Break Weekly, which is, a cousin to This Week in Photo.
Yeah.
All right. Here's another one. Any recommendations on a YouTube channel for more education on Final Cut Pro 10 or video shooting? I have one that I'll
Uh,
throw out there before you go, Lee. There's
yeah.
one called, geez, what is it? Now it's on the tip of my tongue. I can't remember it. It is, hold on. Now, see, I have to bring up my YouTube channel just so that I don't make a fool out of myself. It is, wait for it. You want to know about this? Final Cut Pro. Well, Larry Jordan has his own YouTube channel, which is pretty interesting. So you definitely check that out. And under my subscriptions, can't find it. Lee, talk about yours while I'm looking for mine.
Okay, so my one is actually going back to your recommendation is the MacBreak Weekly guys. So Steve Martin and the team at Ripple Training, they do free tutorials. Normally about once a week, they do a 5 minute Final Cut or motion
Yeah,
tip, and yeah, they're yeah, I can't speak highly enough about those
yeah.
guys.
Well, I found mine. Mine is called, the channel is called Film Riot. Film Riot. And these guys have been on for a while. I think I think they're owned by the Discovery Channel now. I'm not sure, but they've changed hands, but the show remains the same. And the cool thing about Film Riot is it's very well produced, obviously, because these guys know a thing or two about film, and video and all that. But they basically show you a technique and then deconstruct how they did that technique. Like, and it's special effects type stuff. So they might say, "Oh, you want to levitate someone, or you want to show, a giant picking someone up in the backyard with Final Cut, or it's not just Final Cut either. It's basically it's agnostic with regard to editing software, but it's really cool, and the guys seem to really enjoy what they're doing. Lee, have you heard of Film
They
Riot?
are, yeah, they're very entertaining. I love their stuff. Frederick, just going back to a previous question, you can absolutely send a project from iMovie on your Mac to Final Cut Pro really easily. I've just done it. Um, you just select the project that you want to send, and there's actually a command in the file menu that says send event to Final Cut Pro, and it opens up with your cuts, with your edits, everything's fine. So yeah, the only caveat is starting on your iPhone or your iPad. That's not going to work.
Mm.
Getting it from there to the Mac, but if you started a project in iMovie on the Mac, you can open it up in Final Cut Pro and it picks up right from where you left off.
I need to be able to do it on my iPhone. I want to start an interview or something on the iPhone, or even record it on the iPhone, and when I'm in downtime, edit the project to a reasonable state, and then take that project and make it awesome in Final Cut Pro 10. I guess I have to wait.
I am right there with
I
you,
gotta
but
wait.
alternatively, we could all just buy the new thin
Yeah,
MacBooks.
yeah. No, not getting that. Here's an equipment question slash comment. This listener says, I see you mentioned the Tascam DR40. Have you used the newer DR70? It seems to have a nice smaller profile and is easily attached to the top of a tripod.
I haven't used it, but I really wanted one, and the wife kind of went, "What's wrong with the one you have?" And I went, "Nothing." And she went, "Well, then you can't have the new one."
There you go. Very cool. You need two accounts, Lee. Come on, two accounts. The next one is Canon. The Canon 70D supports focus peaking and smooth focus transitions.
Oh, cool.
Help for a beginner. So that was more of a comment than a question. Thank you for that. Someone says Fuji Olympus. Yes, we didn't put those on the list, but yes, I acknowledge Fuji and Olympus are awesome, and I'm still lusting after the Fuji X100 series, and I own an Olympus. Next one. What's your workflow to optimize RAW files off of the A7S for editing?
So, well, I'm assuming you mean RAW in terms of video.
Yeah,
Now
probably.
the A7S doesn't actually shoot RAW in video. In fact, most cameras, unless you get into the Blackmagic cameras or the more high-end video cameras, don't shoot RAW video because RAW video, first of all, it's huge. If you think sort of every single frame is going to be about anywhere from 20 to 40 megabytes per frame, and you've got 25 of those minimum per second.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but in terms of workflow, instead I'll answer that in a sideways way. It's talking about 4K footage out of the A7S. I actually recently just did a review, which I haven't published yet, of the Atomos Shogun, which is a 4K recorder for many cameras, but specifically for the A7S. the way Final Cut works is, and Premiere does this very much as well, is that when you're actually editing the footage, you're not actually editing the 4K raw stuff. Well, not raw, but the raw clips. You're generally going to convert your stuff into proxy files. So you can actually specify in Final Cut when you import your files, create a proxy version of this file, and what that'll do is that'll create a really high quality, smaller, compressed version of that file. So when you're actually editing your footage, it's working with those smaller files so your computer doesn't struggle as much.
Yep.
And it's only when you then go to export that it will then reference the original files, and you can then export in full quality format.
Yep. Very cool. All right, I'm going to take a couple more, and then you're off the hook, Lee. Next one is blah, 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 camera video. Oh, why shoot 4K versus 1080p?
Oh, we don't have the time for that. I actually talk about that in my review, where at the moment I don't. A few of the real big challenges with 4K is the files are huge. Your computer needs to be really grunty. You're going to, like I was always going to call my 4K review, we're going to need a bigger hard drive, like we're going to need a bigger boat,
Yeah.
because it will change your workflow. At the moment, the main thing that I'm shooting for, like interviews, the reason to shoot 4K in interviews would be, Frederick, we spoke about this, is if you want to punch in, so you might start, compose your interview shot quite wide, and then because 4K is effectively 4 HD resolution, you can then punch in by 4 times and have sort of a wide and a close-up from the same camera. I'm not a huge fan of that because artistically I feel that's still the same angle, it's still the same depth of field, it's still too similar. I still prefer having 2 cameras. Where I'm really getting a lot of 4K stuff is a lot of my B-roll, particularly location stuff. So if a corporate client's going to fly me out to Hong Kong to shoot a whole bunch of stuff for them, to get out there to shoot more stuff again, if they then want a 4K version, is going to be a bit of a pain in the tush. Mm-hmm. So I'm sort of archiving as much 4K stuff as possible now, so that when in 1, 2, 3 years' time, clients are coming back to me saying, hey, we'd really love a 4K version of that thing you shot for us a couple of years ago, I don't have to go out and shoot it again. Because at the moment, I've yet to have a client ask me for a 4K delivery.
Yeah, I'm sure that'll change.
It will change, but at the moment, the stuff that I'm shooting in 4K is more for future-proofing myself.
Well, here's another sort of add-on question to that. Is 4K from a Micro Four Thirds camera good enough for corporate?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, HD from a Micro Four Thirds is good for a corporate. It's funny, it's with some corporates, depending on who it is, I've had to rig up my little Micro Four, because I've got a GH4 as well, and I've got an A7S, I've got Blackmagic cameras. I've had to rig up those little cameras to look a lot bigger than they are. Mm-hmm. I mean, 90% of the time when I put a Mac box on the front of my camera, it's for an indoor shoot, which is pointless. It's just to make it look fancier. So in terms of the final results, that's all that matters. And again, it depends on where it's going. Like if it's going to be shot and it's going to be shown in a cinema, it still doesn't matter, because if you shoot in 4K, that's still going to be huge. Even 1080 in a cinema is going to be great. So, no, I think as long as we're educating our clients, and as long as our clients have seen our footage, and we can turn around and go, well, I know I've turned up with a small camera, but that's that footage that you liked on my website from that other stuff is why you're hiring me. Mm-hmm. That was all shot on this camera. So yeah, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Follow up to that, 1920 by 1080 at 60 frames a second, or 1280 by 720 at 60 or at 60p, which is the best choice for web usage?
I think the 1080 nowadays, because most stuff, Vimeo, YouTube, they all play back at 1080. They're even starting to introduce 4K. So if you can get the higher resolution and you've got the workflow for it, go for it. Every now and again, like the A7S, if I want to get 100 frames per second out of it, I've got to drop it down to APS-C mode and 720. And I will do that sometimes, like if I'm shooting confetti at someone else, you really want to slow that down and make it beautiful and smooth. So 50 is going to be okay, but 100 is going to be better. I wouldn't shoot a whole thing at 720, because if you think about it, even an iPhone nowadays, the screen's going to play back stuff at 1080. Yeah. So yeah, if you can get more resolution, it's better. But really, 720, 99% of people who are watching stuff on TV, it's still 720 anyway. So yeah, it's more if you needed to really slow it down, what's going to dictate the answer to that question is 50 frames per second going to be good enough, or do I need 100 frames per second? If I need 100 frames per second, I'll deal with the 720. And if you think about it also, when you're actually playing that back, you're only using maybe 5 to 10 seconds of that clip.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you've got 5 or 10 seconds that's at 720 as opposed to 1080, nobody's going to notice.
All right, next questions. How do you handle lighting if you're shooting as a one-person operation? Recommendations on ways to bring supplemental lighting.
I work out a lot, so that is a challenge, and I mean that's one of the reasons why I love shooting with the A7S, because it's amazing in low light.
Right.
But I shoot with the GH4 as well, which is not as amazing in low light, but is amazing for other reasons.
Yeah.
So it depends on the shoot. Try and pick locations that have got good natural light. Other than that, you're just going to be schlepping a lot of lights with you at the end of the day. And I, from a corporate point of view, that's actually something I talk about to my clients in pre-production.
Mm-hmm.
That I say to them, just so you understand, when I turn up for a shoot, unless I'm hiring a crew, and if I can afford it and I can bring people to help, I will hire a crew. But as a one-man band, I'll say to them, just be aware that when I turn up, it's going to take me about an hour to set up.
Yeah. And I would add to that, there's been some really cool advances in continuous lighting over the past, I don't know, year or so. There's a company called Filex, Filex, that makes some really, really cool rugged LED systems that will have a mount on them that will actually take Profoto light modifiers on the front of them, and they're to me they're kind of like the Apple of lighting, because they have this attention to detail and craftsmanship in their lights that just, you can feel it, like magnets for the light modifiers to snap onto the front, and just feels really high tech what they're doing. And they're really good guys. They're actually here in the Bay Area as well. And then the other one is I use these things called ice lights from Westcott, and they're basically a big lightsaber, or a small lightsaber actually. I'm looking at one right now, like a small lightsaber that puts out daylight balanced light that you can then dim up and down. They're battery powered, or you can plug them in. So they're really good for location. You can go in your suitcase and that sort of thing. I use them all the time. I haven't really traveled much with them yet, although I will, but they're ideal for that. They fit in a carry-on and you're good to go. Negatives about the ice lights, I guess all these lights in general, is they are not cheap, right? These lights are not cheap. I think the ice lights, last time I checked, they were in the $500 each range. So you're looking at an investment in these guys if you're really serious about this stuff.
Well, I think that's also a good point to make, that if you're moving from photography into film or video, things are gonna get expensive.
Yeah.
It's if you get into, like, we were talking about this the other day, where me and a video mate were talking a couple of weeks ago about a tripod that we both saw that we really liked, and we were like, wow, that tripod's only $1,500. That's really cheap. And for a video tripod, that is really cheap. Whereas, if I was talking to a photographer friend of mine, they're like, $1,500 for a tripod? Are you crazy?
Exactly.
So, when you get into video, your perspectives change about costs and price.
Yeah, it's kind of like the difference between women's clothes and men's clothes. Our T-shirt will cost $10, and your women's T-shirts will be like $75 for the same T-shirt. Inexplicable. Yeah. I don't know. All right, 2 more questions, and then we're out of here. This next one is pluralize even necessary if you use Final Cut synchronization?
That's a very good question. So for those who don't know what Pluralize is a third-party application that a lot of filmmakers and videographers use for syncing audio and video and syncing multicam clips and things like that. I think where Pluralize is really good is if you've got, a lot of clips that you want to synchronize at once. Whereas Final Cut, as you saw in the example that I was showing, you've got to sort of select one, select that, these two synchronize, blah, blah. Whereas Pluralize, you can do it sort of a lot at once. I don't use Pluralize a lot myself, but I know a lot of people who do use it. So again, it comes down to personal preference. Yeah, so mine is, yeah, like the syncing stuff in Final Cut works perfectly fine for me, so I don't use Pluralize. I've got it, but I don't use it. But then again, I know people who swear by it, so I'm so diplomatic in my answers, aren't I? It's terrible.
Well, yeah. Well, you can continue the conversation online. Last question here, and we'll leave it at this, is I have some old DV footage. What is the optimal workflow to get it in for editing via iMovie, then export to Final Cut Pro 10, or import directly into Final Cut Pro 10?
I'm assuming these are video clips. They're not actually on a DVD.
Well, you said DV footage, so like I would imagine it's on a DV footage. Tape or something, like a mini DV. Remember old mini DV cassettes?
Oh yeah. I've got a drawer full of them. That's a really good question. I haven't come up against that for a while. You'd need. I don't even think iMovie will do it. You might actually need like a third-party company to convert them for you. Just in terms of getting it off of the camera, because, or like if you have Final Cut Pro 7, or if you can get a copy of Final Cut Pro 7, Final Cut Pro 7 could pull it in, and then you could push out Apple ProRes files out of Final Cut Pro 7, or the older iMovie. But you have to go back pretty far for an iMovie, because I'm pretty sure iMovie nowadays doesn't have an option to bringing in tape, because yeah, that's another thing that Apple did with Final Cut Pro 10, is they kind of went, tape is dead to us.
Yeah. And now optical is dead to them too. So I suppose in answer to that, if you've got some legacy software that you can get hold of, like Final Cut Pro 7 or on like maybe iMovie 6, you might be able to do that. You'd also need your Mac would have to be old enough that it would have a FireWire port, I'm assuming. Hey, someone posted. Yeah. Thanks for posting this. Someone posted Grass Valley ADVC 110 to transfer. So I'm gonna have to Google that because I want to know that too, because I have a drawer full of tapes that I need to somehow get current. All right, well, Lee, we're going to leave it at that. Thank you so much for doing this webinar. I think this was excellent. In fact, someone posted, there's a couple of comments in there that say, thanks for hosting this. Excellent session. Lee, you rock. Amazing. So
thanks, Mom.
You can start your day with your ego on high. I think this webinar went really well. And folks that are watching / listening to this will be archived and available at thisweekinphoto.com/webinars within the next couple of days. So just keep an eye out for that. And as we do additions to this webinar with follow-ons that are more specific with regard to photography and cinemagraphs and hybrid photography and all that stuff, there will be a whole series in this line that you'll have access to. This is just the first one, and this is a way to get Lee introduced to you guys and also to get our toe in the water on this particular topic. So thanks again for hanging in there and watching us, or watching Lee actually do this webinar. And stay tuned for an email or social media post on when this is available and for the next one. So we'll see you guys in the next webinar.
Cool. Thanks, guys.